Hey, Bill, thanks for joining.
Yeah, hi Alicia.
All right. So, as we get ready to close out this year-long series, over the last year, we have talked at length in this series and on the site about the multiple major federal investments that have been made in the last few years. So, as we come to this final installment of Follow the Money, I just wanted to spend some time with us just chatting about our observations and what we are looking forward to. So, first, on the observations front, let's talk about ARPA specifically, since that pot of
Mhm.
money has been out the longest and has some of the probably more meatier observations. So, can you talk to us about what are three of the most notable trends you have seen in the past couple of years as it pertains to ARPA spending?
Yeah, sure thing. So one trend I would point out that's hard to overlook is how much of the money went toward revenue replacement. And to really appreciate what happened there, you have to kind of wind back the clock to March of 2021 when ARPA was signed. And remember that at that point, local governments were, especially, states, the picture was a little more nuanced, but local governments especially were in a very tough spot financially. A lot of them are looking at, really tough budget outlook, the potential for layoffs, agency cuts, things along those lines. So the fact that they were able to take American Rescue Plan money, pour it back into their operating budgets, and kind of shore up their budgets to get through the pandemic and the costs that it had caused for them, and revenue losses as well. That's a big deal, and it's maybe easy to forget now, as more time has passed since the law was enacted. I think another trend I would point to is what's been alluded to during this session, and it's also something that our that Liz Farmer, who writes our public finance newsletter that goes out a couple times a month, highlighted earlier this year, which is the scale of the workforce investments that have taken place with American Rescue Plan funding. So based on Liz's analysis back in August, at that time, there had been about $577 million of state and local American Rescue Plan funding obligated to workforce programs specifically. And that was on top of another $500 million that the Economic Development Administration was managing that had been allocated by the federal government under the American Rescue Plan that was specifically, grants focused on workforce development. So, in that $577 million figure, I mean, the number is probably even larger than that by now. So you're talking about, $1 billion of federal money going toward workforce development initiatives across the country. And so that in itself seems pretty notable. And then lastly, I think another trend I would point to is how some places have used this money for, I don't know if you'd call them experimental, but sort of, more innovative programs that they might not have been able to either expand or get off the ground, had it not been for this extra federal funding. And so examples here would be things like, motel to housing conversions to get homeless individuals housed, things like guaranteed income programs in some cities, as well as we've covered a couple of programs that local governments have launched to, for instance, pay back medical debt that residents have. So those are kind of three trends among many that are out there. I'm sure if you asked other people, they might point to other things, but three things that kind of stand out to me.
Yeah, I think that last one in particular about the more innovative programming and to see people being more willing to experiment where it had felt at times they were much more hesitant to do things like that has been pretty notable.
Yeah.
So as you look across all the federal investments, what has surprised you about them?
Yeah, so a couple things here. I mean, I think one thing, and there may be people who would disagree with this statement, but I think that when you take into consideration the size of the state and local fiscal recovery fund program, $350 billion. It's a brand new program that the federal government stood up in the midst of the pandemic, dealing with thousands of local governments as well as all the states all across the country. When you look at the relative level of smoothness that the federal government has managed to have when it comes to working with the states and localities on this, and the Treasury guidance and everything else, I think I think it's actually gone pretty well. I mean, there's definitely, especially for smaller local governments, there are some out there that would complain about administrative burden when it comes to reporting requirements and things along those lines. But it seems like in general, the administration of the program, with the federal government working with the states and localities, has gone relatively smoothly. And I think it's very fair to say that the states and localities are happy with the way that in general, happy with the way that the guidance turned out from the Treasury Department to set the rules for the program. I think another thing that I would point out as surprising is, again, to sort of rewind. I mean, if you were to go back to 2019 and ask people if they thought they would be seeing, a $350 billion state and local aid program, a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, plus the billions in subsidies coming through, the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't think a lot of people in the state and local community would have been confident that that level of federal investment in the states and localities and in workforce development, economic development, in industrial policy, that would be, on the horizon, at least not to that scale. Now, that's of course with the huge caveat that we went through a pandemic in between, then and now, which of course was a big event. But still, I mean, it's a lot of money to flow from the federal government down to the state and local level. So I think that in itself is, somewhat surprising that all this legislation did, materialize in the past couple of years.
Yeah, and to your point on that, just remembering my NGA days before that, it was just always such a bear for states and locals to get anything from the federal government. Like every year was a fight on what their grant programs were going to look like. So it's just like we have gone the complete opposite way in the last couple of years.
Just to sort of follow up on your comment, I remember covering like budget debates back in the 2017, 2018 era, when a big sticking point for cities was, would they see community development block grants go, from the, whatever it was, $2.7 billion range to $3 billion range. And that was like a big consideration so to think about the scale of the money that's out there now is notable. So.
Right. And talking about that scale of the money, it's coming. We're talking about workforce today, but that money has come at a time when the state and local government workforce has struggled to fully recover from the worker losses that were triggered from the pandemic. As we've talked about, the silver tsunami is here. So given all that, and you talked about the smoothness on the federal side, just how is all that affecting the management of federal investments from the state and local side of things?
Yeah. So for me, it's somewhat, I almost feel like you have to look at the workforce discussion and the federal funding discussion as happening on two parallel tracks. And the way I kind of think about it that way is there definitely are ways that the federal funding can help with some of the workforce issues that state and local governments are dealing with. Salary definitely is a factor in many cases, competing with the private sector. We heard in one of the earlier panels from Memphis, where they're offering large bonuses and relocation funds to police and so forth. And, we've covered other places that are doing similar things. But there's a kind of broader set of factors in play here. And again, some of these things earlier panelists have touched on. But, you have, a real shift in workers wanting a greater deal of flexibility with hybrid and remote work arrangements. Governments are traditionally more rigid. So, it's taken them time to sort of embrace those kinds of, workplace arrangements. In some places they can't because of, laws or rules. So, that's one factor. I mean, in addition to that, I mean, police and fire recruiting has been a perennial challenge in recent years. I mean, even with the bonuses in play in some places, it's again, with salary being a factor, IT, engineering oriented positions, that those have always, in past years been a struggle to recruit for. So I guess I just mentioned all this to say it seems to me there's more than a salary issue in play here. I mean, you also have, a kind of generational shift with the workforce happening right now, where you mentioned the silver tsunami. You have, millennials and Gen Z folks coming into the workforce who aren't necessarily looking for the same kinds of, the same kind of maybe 20, 30-year setup at the same job that their predecessors were. So that's another consideration there. So there's a lot going on. And then, I mean, at the same time, government jobs are changing as well. I mean, as there's more digital services rolling out, technology is changing processes within agencies. So there's just a lot of change taking place right now, and there are a lot of pressures on the workforce that I think extend beyond just salary. And actually, I would say for folks who are really interested in the topic, we just had a great 3-part series from our columnists Catherine Barrett and Richard Green, who they kind of did an outlook on the future of state and local government work, and I think they really kind of walk through some of the issues I'm trying to get at here, and do a really nice job kind of giving an overview. So I'd encourage people to check that out.
So you said the keyword change, and let's talk about some political change that's on the horizon in a few weeks as the U.S. House of Representatives will flip to Republican control. So what will that mean in terms of oversight of federal investments, and what should state and local governments be ready for?
Yeah, I mean, I think as our intrepid Capitol Hill reporter Carrie Murakami has highlighted on a number of instances in the past year, I think Republicans, House Republicans in particular, are eager for more intense oversight of American Rescue Plan spending in particular. So I think you can expect to see some hearings. You can expect to see folks from the state and local government community going over to the Hill, testifying, making the case for why the American Rescue Plan spending that has taken place, why it makes sense. I think what you have to think about, kind of bigger picture here, is there's a big picture debate going on between Republicans and Democrats, whether this kind of big government approach to passing down money to states and localities, big federal government approach passing down money to the states and localities, whether it can work, and whether it can actually result in programs and projects that have a positive impact on communities. And part of that is part of that's going to have to part of how that is judged is going to have to do somewhat with how state and local governments kind of tell the story about how they've used this money. And I think an interesting example here is there's been a lot of one of the areas that's been a target for Republican criticism in the past year or so has been spending on different tourism related programs. And in one regard, it's easy for critics to point to something like investing in I forget which state now, but like a bourbon trail, for instance, and saying like, oh, that doesn't make sense as a spending of federal pandemic aid dollars. But when you think about it from another perspective, tourism was one of the hardest hit areas during the pandemic, and so thinking about it in that way, perhaps using state and local funding to give a boost to tourism related industries, makes a lot of sense. So that's a debate that's going to play out in the coming year here in hearings and other forums, and I don't see it being settled anytime soon. Another thing I would just flag on this front, though, is as these conversations do take place, there was a real emphasis on evidence-based policymaking and data collection, not just in the American Rescue Plan, but just under the Biden administration in general. They've put an emphasis on it. And, in recent years, local governments, many state and local governments have as well. And, I think the stronger case that states and localities are able to make using, concrete data about the results of their programs to say, here were the goals we outlined at the start of this, here's what we were trying to achieve by spending this money. And, here's the data and the performance metrics to sort of show the result and back up, what we were trying to, show that it paid off somehow. I think when you have that kind of information to present, it becomes a little bit more difficult to, assail some of these investments, and they become, easier to defend. So these all be, kind of interesting things to watch. And the only other thing I'd point out is, it's not just Capitol Hill where this spending will be scrutinized. I mean, you also have entities like the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, as well as, state and local auditors who are all going to be carrying out extensive oversight of the spending in the years to come here. So that'll all be, something to watch.
So we've got a couple more minutes, so let me squeeze in two final questions. So you quickly mentioned the CHIPS and Science Act earlier, and then of course, I'm sure folks are familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, which are just going to bring another tranche of money in different ways to state and local government. So what are some of the key activities to watch as those programs unfold?
Yeah, so I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is a huge piece of legislation. I think one thing, excuse me, one thing we'll be watching there is how state and local governments design their own programs to sort of supplement what the federal government has tried to do, what Congress and the Biden administration have tried to do with that piece of legislation. And that could look a number of ways. I mean, a big push within that law is, electrification of buildings and so forth. So, really pushing the transition to heat pumps, electric water heaters, things like that. So, I mean, will you see more states, reconsidering their building codes to try to, incorporate technology like that into new development or existing development? Will you see them offering their own subsidies to try to supplement federal subsidies that are available, things along those lines? So that's kind of one thing I would look out for there. On chips, that's going to be interesting to watch. I mean, from an economic development perspective, for a number of reasons. I mean, there's the Tech Hubs program in there, which seeks to create these technology hubs outside of the traditional coastal areas like the Bay Area and Boston and New York, and try to create new centers for technology oriented industries all across the country. And that's definitely going to be a program to watch. The money for that isn't appropriated yet, so that's a thing to watch in the near term that we'll be covering. But beyond that, I mean, beyond just the tech hubs themselves, I mean, just the fact that there's so much federal money getting funneled towards the semiconductor industry, domestic semiconductor industry, how that industrial development plays out, the communities where it takes place, what sorts of state incentive packages in terms of tax breaks and so forth might come into play there, in terms of like trying to lure different companies to different places. Those will all be things to watch, I think, as well.
So on the theme of things to watch, why don't you tell the audience for next year what are some of those main themes that the Route 50 is going to be covering on federal investments?
Yeah, so I mean, some of those things I just walked through there, sort of the economic development story around the CHIPS Act will be one. The rollout of the IRA programs will be another. I mean, and beyond the subsidies, there's also, in the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, there are also, just straight grant programs that state and local governments will be able to tap into there. Everything from, planting more trees to, cleaning up air pollution around ports, things like that. So a wide range of new programs to watch in that piece of legislation. Also the Reconnecting Communities program, which we just had an article about today, which, that money can be used for revamping or even tearing down highways that were, cut through communities in decades past. So that's another one we'll be watching. Apart from that, I mean, it's tied more to the infrastructure bill, but we've had a lot of coverage on the electric vehicle charger build out. That's definitely something that has a concrete link back to the federal funding that's going to go out to states to build out the charger network. We'll be continuing to cover that narrative. I mean, that's a huge storyline, how that network gets built out and where chargers are placed, and how they're placed in cities versus in rural areas, and all the different nuance there. The other one we haven't talked about is broadband. There's debate. Again, we've had some great recent coverage on this around the broadband maps, how accurate they are. These are the maps that'll guide the allocation of about $42 billion of funding for broadband expansion and service improvement around the country. So that's another thing to watch, how that debate around the maps plays out, and then also where that money ends up going and what types of projects it goes toward funding. And then the last thing I think I'd watch isn't so much related directly to federal programs as much as it is just kind of the general financial condition of state and local governments heading into next year. It's obviously a shifting time for the economy with inflation, with the economy slowing down, the tech industry seeing pretty substantial layoffs by some companies. And so this federal money, I mean, it's definitely combined, when you combine it with much better than expected revenues in the past couple of years, it's been a fairly, good time for state and local finances. And I think as the federal money starts to get allocated, spent down, as the economic winds kind of shift, it feels like we're kind of headed into a new era for, state and local budget health. So what happens there, and how much of a buffer some of this federal money offers, and then also to what extent states and localities are able to take full advantage of the federal funding, given their individual budget situations, will be something else to watch. I mean, if they're in a tight spot, if a place is in a tight spot budget wise, they may be more, reluctant to launch a new subsidy program that could complement something in the Inflation Reduction Act or something along those lines. So those are some of the things that I think we'll be watching in the months ahead.
Bill, thanks so much for spending some time with me, chatting with me, so we can kind of contextualize all of this for the audience today.
Sure thing. Yeah. Nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you too. That's all the time we have today, but I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today and throughout our entire Follow the Money series. To our underwriters, thank you for your support. And to all of you who tuned in today and throughout the year, thank you. As Bill mentioned, Route 50 will continue to cover these issues in 2023 and beyond. So be sure to subscribe to our newsletter by visiting route-50.com. For Route 50, I'm Alicia Powell Gillis. Take care.